Welcome to the Backyard Bounty Podcast from heritageacresmarket.com, where we talk about all things backyard poultry, beekeeping, gardening, sustainable living, and more. And now, here's your host, Nicole.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Backyard Bounty. I'm your host, Nicole, and today we are joined by Mikhail, founder of Apis Arborea, and he's here to talk to us about the amazing honeybee. And Mikhail, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm so excited to have you on the show today. I know that I've been reading a lot of your works, and you have a really amazing viewpoint and philosophy on honeybees. So can you kind of explain to us a little bit more what Apis Arborea is and how you got into beekeeping?
Yeah, you start with two huge questions.
I apologize.
So maybe I'll start with your second question, how I ended up living with bees. And that really happened about 20 years ago after going through a winter with lots of dreams. Bees really came to me in dreams during that one winter. And they made me wonder whether this would be the time to invite them into my life in this world. And what happened was that I knew about a beekeeper in my area, and I just asked him whether I could borrow an empty bee box. And he said, of course. And I placed it behind my house. It was spring and swarm season. And then one midday, early afternoon, I was living on a farm at that time. People were calling my name and said, oh, there are so many bees around your house. And so I ran to the house, and the swarm had, of course, found that empty box and was trying to move into the box. But it was so tightly closed that they really couldn't all the way. And I remember to this day, I ran over there and just moved the lid a little bit to the side and gave them a bee space or two. And I just watched the genie going into the bottle. That's how it felt that moment. And that was the beginning of my life with bees.
Wow.
Yeah. And from there, lots of things happened. And in regards to your second question, what Apis Arborea is about? Well, Apis Arborea was founded in 2017. It's one of my youngest projects, so to say. And beginning with the name, I felt that the Latin name Apis mellifera, the honey-making one, was an unfortunate name we had given this being, because the focus on honey is at least partially responsible for the high mortality rates of honeybees. The focus on honey just made us blind to other things. And I felt like I wanted to shift the focus on other things, like habitat, for example. And so I just renamed Apis mellifera into Apis Arborea, the one who is connected with trees and lives in trees and has been living in trees really for many millions of years, has evolved in an arboreal framework, really. And so that was one reason why we end up naming it Apis Arborea, to shift the focus and to help doing so by using a name for it. And then, of course, this century has began with what has been called colony collapse disorder. When was that? In 2003 or 5? I'm not all the way sure. But that was a very rough beginning. And in addition to that, then mortality rates really increased. And in the US, as we probably all know, the annual mortality rate is around 42% of all the hives in this country are dead after 1 year, which is about 1 million of registered hives, plus an unknown number, which is not registered, flying under the radar. So in other words, one could say that the time we live in has radically shifted in a way where it really encourages us to think outside of the box, literally, but also pertaining to all other dimensions of apiculture and research and apiculture practices and such. And I felt that Apis Arborea could hopefully be a resource for stepping into a different kind of territory, researching other ways of being with bees. And also, I see Apis arborea as a resource platform for developing cutting-edge programs which focus on conservation and preservation of Apis arborea, of Apis mellifera.
So you mentioned that, the focus on honey production being
Yes.
one of the major impacts to honeybees. What do you think are some of the other threats that honeybees face?
Oh boy, I think there are so many, and we can definitely name a few. It begins with modern agricultural practices and the usage of pesticides, all kinds of pesticides, not only neonicotinoids, which are talked about a lot, which have been already banned in Europe, and I think Germany has been just phased it out for good now, forever, ever. So that's a big one. But also other insecticides and fungicides have an impact on resilience and survival of Apis mellifera, of honeybees. So that's that. Loss of habitat is really huge. Shift in agricultural usage of landscapes. Then we have to list commercial beekeeping. Commercial beekeeping as a framework of an industrial approach to animal stewardship. So we have to look at commercial beekeeping and how commercial beekeeping operates completely outside of any kind of regulations. There's not a single regulations in any of the 50 states which grant any sort of rights to honeybees when it comes to commercial beekeeping applications and operations. But chickens have rights, dogs have rights. Honeybees don't really have any rights. We all are familiar with the concept of animal feedlots. Mm-hmm. That's a good introduction for the description of what commercial beekeeping really is. Okay. It's an operation which is really driven by profit and some sort of commodity thinking, which is really driven to the edge. I would say it actually, commercial beekeeping, how it is practiced in this country, includes animal torture and does not follow ethics nor moral. Plus, commercial beekeeping in this country is responsible for the spread of so many diseases and parasites.
And what are some of the practices that commercial beekeepers participate in that you feel is detrimental to the honeybee? Just maybe for those that aren't familiar with some of the practices of commercial beekeepers.
It's everything. So the first thing I would say is that it is not science-based, it's profit-based. Most of the practices are outside of scientific research and knowledge. That being is not recognized as a sentient being. It is treated like a car engine with interchangeable parts where the leg of a cow is put on another cow and the head is cut off and put another cow. It's really the equivalent of that kind of practice. There's a good film out there. It's called More Than Honey. It accompanies some commercial beekeepers in this country and it shows their practices, and it will make you cry. It will break your heart when you just see how bees are treated. And it even breaks your heart without being a beekeeper. So it's a good film to watch, More Than Honey.
I did see that on Netflix, and not having any firsthand experience with commercial operations, I was really shocked. Even if not all of the commercial operations are like that, the fact that there's even one that made it onto the film was incredibly appalling.
Yeah, it is appalling. And what I find really surprising is that there is this fundamental question of why are honeybees dying? Why are they in such a precarious situation? Why is their health so fragile? When one looks at those kind of practices, it's pretty obvious why. To a large extent, mortality rates are due to all those practices. Here it gets really interesting because, let's see, if I want to tell a little story, okay?
Sure.
So imagine one would go into the zoo as an entomologist, as a researcher, because one wanted to study the nature of tigers and elephants. So here we go. We go into the zoo and we observe tigers and elephants in the zoo, how they live in the zoo, what they do. And you will see the tiger pace all the way back and forth in front of the fence. And you'll watch the elephant looking really depressed. And that field research then is your foundation of everything you want to learn from these animals. And also and then you write manuals how to take care of animals, how to take care of tigers and elephants. So in the 20th century, research of Apis mellifera, of honeybees, was just done in white boxes. That was, so to say, the zoo. The zoo where Apis mellifera was studied. And in the 1970s, a very few researchers, a very few entomologists began to actually go back into the natural habitat of honeybees, which is the forest, into wild conditions, and started collecting data. And what they found was that honeybees are doing extremely well, are very resilient, very healthy, and also they live much longer. Their mortality rates are way down. Survival rates are very up. The worse it got for commercial beekeeping, the more interested people became in studying Apis mellifera in the wild. And now, in the last 20 years, I would say, it really has taken off because it's quite compelling. People want to find out, why are they surviving? When the conventional paradigm says, without us humans at this point in time treating honeybees and keeping them alive, we would lose them. So the survival of honeybees depends on humans, as crazy as they may sound. What I'm saying is the researchers left the zoo and are now getting real data on honeybees. And that is one big part of Apis arborea, to incorporate that kind of research data on wild honeybees into programs, into preservation and the conservation of honeybees. And that's why I like to call it rewilding. We are rewilding honeybees. We are rewilding nest habitat, and we are rewilding the outer scape as well. So what I'm trying to say is that we have so much data, which is a fundamental resource for us to shift our ways in beekeeping. And unfortunately, commercial beekeeping, and I would say mainstream beekeeping in general, has not woken up to the science. And it's still practicing in those very old ways, which do not reflect really who that being is we are trying and hoping to take care of.
So when you say bee rewilding, what kind of shifts do you think need to be implemented to support the bees and implement the rewilding practice that you suggest?
So there's an entire range of parameters, we could say. One definitely starts with the actual nest habitat. So instead of calling it hive, I like to refer to it as a nest. So the nest of wild honeybees has a certain kind of volume. And Thomas Thiele from Cornell, he has done lots of research. He's one of those researchers. He has done lots of research on wild honeybees. And he looked at natural nest volumes and found out that it's relatively small in comparison to what we are used to in our beekeeping paradigm, conventional beekeeping paradigm. And so in terms of numbers, it's really only around 30 to 40 liters. You know, research is metric. So let's say 10 gallons max. That's only one Langstroth box. And if you talk to beekeepers, they would laugh at you to say one box is the end. Because, I mean, everybody is teaching you put as many as possible on top. And then all of a sudden there may be 4 or 5 or 6. So you call the number. And so it's a small volume. And now once we could identify one of those parameters, like nest volume, now what Thomas Thiele did, he started a study. He compared that natural nest volume to those very enlarged volumes of hives in regular beekeeping operations. And that's all he did. There was a study, small 40 liters nest hive, and then compared with the quadruple of that. And that's all he did. And then at the end of the study, it was very powerful to look at the outcome, because it was the mortality rates of the larger ones were way higher. The number of mites was just mind-boggling in the larger one. So it was very clear that by maintaining natural nest volume, it just changed the entire situation for honeybees in a way where their health was more robust and they lived longer. All the health parameters were up. Very powerful, extremely powerful. So you see, that's where it's so powerful to identify instinctual preferences and natural nest parameters and study them and compare them and see what's the difference. So nest volume is one feature we incorporate in our work at Apis Arborea. Then the next one is also an interesting one. It has to do with insolation values of those nests. Imagine honeybees living in a tree, and so they're in the core, in the center of a tree trunk, surrounded by 5 to 8 inches of wood with a small opening, versus a Langstroth hive or any kind of man-made hive, which uses 3/4 inch thick lumber. Mm-hmm. When you look at those, when you compare those two different hives and look at it with an infrared camera, which shows where the heat escapes, it's amazing to see that. It's very obvious how much heat is being lost in those thin-walled hives.
Absolutely.
And then this man, this English guy, I think his name is Mitchell, he wrote a paper about this. Several people actually have been now focusing on that. But Mitchell, what he did, he looked at clustering. So bees, when it's too cold, all the bees start to cluster. And what that means is a lot of metabolic processes come to a halt. And where bees typically would move freely everywhere in the nest, on comb, in darkness, when it's getting so cold that it's not possible anymore, they cluster. They all contract. They just cuddle. They huddle together to maintain a minimum threshold, a minimum core temperature. And in thin-walled hives, that onset of clustering can be already around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, versus the onset of clustering in tree hives is around minus 25 Fahrenheit.
Wow.
So, in other words, clustering is a symptom of an extremely stressful situation. Clustering symbolizes an attempt to survive extremely cold conditions. In the conventional ways of beekeeping, clustering is just part of the vocabulary. We think as if that is within the very normal behavior of this animal, when in fact, it's a stress position, one could say. You see what I mean, what I'm getting to?
I do.
In other words, that stress then will affect that being on all levels. Physiologically, in their physiology and their metabolism, immunity, health, emotionally, on all levels. And that is, in thin-walled hives, that clustering is normal. It's a normal occurrence, where in tree hives, it's rare, you see? Mm-hmm. And that has to do with hive humidity and dew points. You probably know that topic. People talk about wet hives and fungi, growth of fungi, but wet comb. Right. And that then it's a struggle for beekeepers to keep those hives dry and not wet, because what they know is water running down outside combs, especially in those in winter and early spring. And then what is done is people set ventilation hives so air can run through the hive, treating this like a house, not like the inside of a being. Mm-hmm. And now I want to pick up that word I just used, dew points. So the dew point is the place where a certain kind of temperature meets a certain kind of humidity, percentage of humidity. And all of a sudden, humidity in the air, water in the air condenses. And that's where the dew point is. In tree hives, that dew point is, if we have let's call it a 6-inch thick wall, that dew point is somewhere in the middle of that wall. In a thin-walled hive, in a Langstroth hive, the dew point is actually 2 frames inside. Because of the lack of proper insulation, we have placed the dew point inside the hive. And that creates problems wherever we look. And it creates stress for honeybees. But we see it only as condensation. And then we come up with all those ideas. But it is missing the point, because we never treat the true root cause for the condensation inside. But we always try to tamper with it and make it better. But in the long run, we are making it worse.
So for those beekeepers that have Langstroth hives, and let's say they're not open to changing their hive style, is there anything that they can do to modify their hive or anything to help support the bees and eliminate or reduce some of these issues?
Of course, we can insulate. We can give it lots of insulation, and not only during winter, but throughout the entire year, in all seasons. Insulate. There are different ways of doing it. One would be I work with, let's see. There are different ways of doing it. One possible choice could be cork panels, thick cork panels, or sewing kind of pillowcase-like containers, sacks. We can sew pillowcases and fill them with wood shavings. Some people use straw bales. Whatever works for you. But I would say it's key. It's key to grant honeybees that warmth. And it works also both ways. It protects from heat and from cold. This being said, I do want to make a case here for creating completely new ways of housing honeybees. And I'm saying it because one has to remember that the Langstroth hive was invented at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, at a time where people explained life in terms of mechanics. And within that context, the Langstroth hive was just the utmost expression of mechanics. I mean, you look at it and it's all interchangeable. It doesn't follow bees. It follows a mechanistic thinking. The Langstroth hive stands for a completely different zeitgeist and time and space on this earth. We have entered now what people call the 6th extinction. We have entered the Anthropocene. Just 2 days ago, a report was published about birds in Canada and the US, and a 30% decline between the 1970s and now. Earlier this year, you probably have seen the headlines, and they read the insect apocalypse, where we are getting data of this huge shift on the earth, where we see species going extinct. And honeybees are some of them, which are, I would call them, endangered. We are running out of time. And I'm saying it this moment because I think we are beyond the Langstroth system. Look, there was a time where we used DDT. It was destroying the world. And we are now at a time where we cannot afford this anymore. We are being called to take radical steps to preserve not only honeybees, but to preserve life on Earth. And, in that context, that I think it would not serve honeybees to wrap up and insulate Langstroth hives. And I mean, who am I to say that? And maybe I'm not right. But what I'm trying to say here is that the larger picture is so different from 1875 or whenever it was invented. And we have entered the 6th extinction. And we have to let that sink in. And then we have to decide, how can we respond? And to me, it is a question of ethics and moral. And I want to say something else here in this context, which has to do with the ways we look at honeybees and the ways how we study them. Because what we think is worth studying can be affected by our paradigms, by our limited understanding of life, for example. In particular, when it comes to honeybees, because we may think of them as insects, cold-blooded insects, and yet they are a mammalian being. This entomologist Jürgen Tautz from the University of Würzburg in Germany calls honeybees the mammal in 1,000 bodies. So we have, even though they appear as insects, they are actually mammalian. Even though they're cold-blooded, and the truth is they're warm-blooded. Their body temperature matches more or less our own temperature range. Honeybee, as in its oneness, can generate fever just like humans can. So you see, we call them social insects. There are dynamics alive in this being. We are still not sure how to understand it. And I want to make now a connection to contemporary life sciences, because for biology and entomology and many other disciplines, something is right now happening. They're going through a fundamental shift. And I want to give you a few examples what this is about.
Okay.
It is centered around the notion of an individual, that we take it so for granted that you as Nicole, you are an individual, and I as Michael am one as well. And of course, the bees are an individual. Where we are in life sciences is right now that life sciences are not able anymore to make a case for individuality. So on an immune level, it's not true anymore that there is such a thing as individual immunity. Genetically, it is not true anymore to think that my genes are independent of the world. But more and more what comes into the foreground is something called symbiosis. And what that is the realization that all living beings are so entangled with each other that they all move together, as if the whole world would be one interdependent web of life. And everything is felt throughout that web. And one area affected will affect the whole. We have to rethink biology. We have to rethink entomology. We have to rethink apiculture, because we still call it colony, which is not correct. It's not a colony. I find myself not knowing anymore what it is, but honeybees hold this. They seem to follow this quite unique matrix of being, quite different from us humans, actually. And as if they were holding answers really important for our own future. So coming all the way back to the box, right? The white, square, rectangular box. It is an old way of thinking. And that thinking constructed that box. But it is time for us to let it go. It does not reflect reality, really. It reflects a belief system. But we don't have time for that anymore.
So what do you think is the answer?
I think it requires of us to think. That's a big question, right? I mean, you're asking me, okay, so how are we solving this? We got into this mess, and can you tell everybody how to get out of it?
Simple answer, I'm sure.
Yeah. But here's, okay, all I can tell you is what I can see with my limited knowledge.
Sure.
And maybe we can identify a few areas where we could change things. I started rehabilitating hives and nests in 2007. And in the beginning, I thought, the moment they have a bee-centric nest, everything will be good. It's a silver bullet. But pretty quickly, it became clear that's not it. It is more complex than that. And where I am with that today is that I do believe that it requires all of us to work together. I currently really believe that we need to come together and pool resources and move together. And just to give you an example of how that could look like, there's a program I developed. I call that Locapiary. It's a play with words on locavore, someone who eats locally. So a Locapiary is a local watershed apiary. And what it does is it takes beekeeping out of the backyard where we all have our hives, our bees, and reshifts the reference frame in a way that it kind of mimics wild conditions in forests. And that begins with providing nest habitat. Similar to owl boxes, in vineyards, you set up log hives and allow swarms to move in. So the habitat is there, bees move in. And then all the people in the watershed come together and identify where are the best places for those bees. How far away do they have to be? Who all of those people in that watershed has bees? Can we talk together and unite behind those instinctual, natural preferences of Apis mellifera? And then we can integrate politics. Can we lobby our county officials to write ordinances which regulate commercial beekeeping? Where I am here in California, you wouldn't believe how many commercial beekeepers have placing their hives here for the winter. Thousands of them. So we are being surrounded by commercial bees. They're all traumatized. They're all spreading viruses and you name it. And so that we would rewrite the narrative of beekeeping. We would rewrite it into a new narrative, one which considers honeybees to be like light and air and warmth. We do not own it, but we can take care of it. We are all the recipient of the benefits of honeybees, but we cannot own them. We can take care of them together. So that's, in a nutshell, what Locapiary is as a program. There are more details to it, but I would say, to sum it up, I think it is essential for us to collaborate and to develop communal programs of stewardship, of conservation and preservation programs, communal programs of rewilding. What I also see is how, while we create new ways on being on the earth, while we are creating a new framework of apiculture, it also creates a new notion of us and the way we see ourselves on this planet. It allows our relationship with nature to evolve in a new way, away from mechanics and more towards entanglement and belonging.
Do you feel that in an effort to support the honeybee and your rewilding and your log hives, which I'd like to talk more about in a moment, do you feel that the best thing to do would be to move away from harvesting honey and just supporting the bees and their environment?
Absolutely.
Do you think there's room for both?
There's room for both. And yet I would suggest to take a break. It's the equivalent of you grew a lot of corn for several years on your farm and now the land needs to rest. So now let's have honeybees rest. Because remember what we said in the beginning, 42% of all honeybees are dead every year. Of all hives, 2.5 million hives, that's 1 million hives every year. We lost the foundation of apian health. And still to focus on honey in some ways really misses the point. It is, I always say to people, instead of harvesting honey, let's harvest some health for a while. And once we are good at that, then let's see how can we do both together at the same time.
Sure.
It is like any kind of land stewardship program on those kind of situations would close it off and say, don't enter. We need 10 years for this to regrow. We need 10 years for all those fragile dynamics to resurrect and be rehabilitated so that after 10 years, we have a foundation we can work with. You see?
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I want to come back to the Anthropocene, to the extinction. There are so many things happening. We have no idea that they're happening. How will the world look like in 10, 20 years? And Nicole, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to doom and gloom. I'm just saying we have to wake up. I mean,
Sure.
look at there's a study which looked at protein content of pollen of goldenrod, and they had pollen in a museum from 1870 and compared it to goldenrod pollen from 2016, I believe, and found that the most recent pollen contained 30% less protein, and that was related to the increased levels of carbon dioxide in the air. I think we are at this moment in time where we have to wake up. We have to wake up to the world, and we cannot continue old narratives. And that's why you're interviewing me, and really all I'm saying is let's rewild those honeybees. Let's go all the way back to how they lived for millions of years, and let's do it in a collective communal way. Let's integrate all the scientific research, all the data. Let's mirror that. And it cannot all the way happen in Langstroth hives. And that may sound radical, and maybe it is radical. Or maybe you do both. Maybe you have a Langstroth hive, but also you experiment with something else. You give back that the birthright of honeybees to be themselves. Like you said earlier, Nicole, to let the bee be a bee. And to grant that right to be, for bees to be a bee. I remember after years of witnessing honeybees in framed hives, I remember to this day when I saw for the first time bees in a log hive, and how I could witness them, that swarm, to grow. And I remember to this day, I opened the lid, and I looked inside, and I felt like, like Armstrong stepping onto the moon. It was something I had never seen before, and it felt as if I was entering a completely different world, as if I was entering the world of honeybees, where I had been moving in the world of humans before, in framed hives. Once you have seen it, you just know better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. No, I absolutely agree with you. Like we were talking before we started recording, I was lucky enough to be gifted.
Yes.
It wasn't given to me as a gift. It was given to me as labor that somebody else didn't want to do. A local member of our bee club collected a very large colony that was in I believe it was an elm tree that was cut down, and they brought me the log with the intent of cutting the log open and removing the nest and placing it into one of my other traditional style hives. And I had been kind of dragging my feet on it because I'm still only about a year out from shoulder surgery, so chainsaws and stuff aren't really something I'm comfortable with currently. And this log is massive. It's the same size as my 500-gallon propane tank. It's probably 6 foot long and 8 foot in diameter. It's gigantic.
Wow.
So I had just kind of been letting it sit. Obviously they're in their log, so there wasn't a huge hurry to get them out of there. And the more that I procrastinated, the more opportunity I got to watch them and to observe them and their behavior and watch them build from afar and get to interact with them every day as I walked out to my car in the morning and just my daily activities around the property. And it's been really interesting and insightful. Over the last couple years, I've spent my time beekeeping, trying to modify my Langstroth hives as best as possible to support the bees in the way that they want to live, instead of expecting them to behave in a certain pattern. I wanted to try to alter my behavior to best support them.
Right.
And it was obvious that the Langstroth is not ideal but it's what most people have, and it's what's easily accessible, and a lot of times it's what's affordable and customary. But in the last couple of months that this Log Hive has been in my life, it's really changed my perspective, and that's one thing I like about the bees is they're always changing my outlook on the world in general.
Yes, they open our eyes in all directions, inside and outside. Who we think we are in relationship to the world and in relationship with ourselves, and also they open our eyes to for us to see and understand them even with greater depth.
You know, I'm often asked by people, especially non-beekeepers, somebody wants to know what's the best way to support the bees. Maybe they don't have the time or the finances or the education or knowledge rather to become a beekeeper, but they want to help the bees. So they always ask me, you know, what kind of flowers should I plant or something? But it sounds like supporting this bee rewilding concept would be a fantastic way for somebody that wants to support the bees to be involved. Yes,
it's very true. And that style of apiculture is very hands-off. It sometimes breaks my heart when I hear people, they say, I want to become a beekeeper, but then they go to beekeeping meetings and they come back home saying, oh, I need to study first, I need to do this and that, and that's all too much, and it's too much money, and I don't have the time. And it really, when it can be so simple as just putting a log hive in the tree and you're done. And then you just watch and wait for bees to move in. And you know what also is such a heartbreaker, Nicole, is there's so many people who want to do good and want to support bees. And some of them say, I will become a beekeeper. I will support bees and I will really provide for them. I will become a steward and I will become a beekeeper. And then they're facing an infrastructure they don't understand all the way. And so they order a so-called bee package and order it and pick it up in the spring and put it in the hive and think, oh, I'm doing so good, so well, and I'm just supporting them. And yet, by buying those bees, they're supporting the conditions which kill bees. Those bee packages, most people begin with a bee package. And they're really, they're Frankenstein bees. They're coming out of, we can call them feedlots. They're coming out of very, very toxic environments, fed with all kinds of insecticides, with high fructose corn syrup. They're tortured bees. And at the end of the season, the end of the pollination season, when they're all done with pollinating almonds in California, they just put them all together, all the hives, and throw bees from different hives, all in that package, plug in an artificially raised queen, and that's what people buy.
Absolutely.
It's so heart-wrenching. And yet it is this tremendous opportunity to create new infrastructures in your own local watershed, to join other people and do it differently. And I think that's where we are right now worldwide. We are in this crisis. And I think where the power is to focus on the opportunity, not on the crisis, but not on the doom and gloom, but on the opportunity to do it differently and to mobilize ourselves and others in finding ways which are more life-supporting and less antibiotic, but probiotic in a time of accelerating extinction rates. And I feel almost a little bit bad to have this interview with you today, but this is all happening right now. Last Friday was the climate march. Today is the climate action meeting at the UN. It's so, we are all awakening to a new awareness of being on this planet. And if we want to save it and keep it livable, we have to move and create completely new ways of being with honeybees. It may be radical in a beautiful way, in a completely life-embracing way. This is not about tweaking beekeeping management practices. This is about rewriting beekeeping. This is about exploring and discovering a way wider richness of the life of honeybees and our own richness of life. And it is about survival. You see, let's give honey a rest. Let's survive first, and then think about ways we could allow honeybees to share honey with us. How about that?
I think that sounds wonderful.
Anyway. I don't know whether you can use this interview for a podcast, but maybe you will.
Of course.
But I do really, it's so strong here right now. This call on all of us to shift. We have to shift.
I agree.
And we have all the data. That's the crazy thing, Nicole. We have all the data and the research. It's just like with climate crisis. It's all there. And no one wants to move because that would entail and will entail to let go of our profit-driven thinking.
Exactly.
And to reorient our lives towards new values, life-embracing values, and not to live at the cost of others. And here's the interesting thing. There is not such a thing as others. Because our lives are so entangled with everything else alive. Our life is so dependent on all life that by not taking care of what is called others, we are not taking care of ourselves. By damaging what we call others, we are damaging ourselves. And that is the new truth of the 21st century. And with bees, it's just like that. We have to discover bees in a very new way. And then let that discovery and let that experience be the foundation of a new paradigm of apiculture. One which allows bees to be bees and which just follows bees. I just spoke with Marian Fraser. She's a well-known entomologist here in the US. And she's studying bees in Kenya. I spoke with her on the phone. She said, the beekeeping in Kenya is just so different than here. And I said, what do you mean? Can you say it in one sentence? And she said, well, what they do there, they're just following the behavior of bees. Where here, bees are forced to follow our blueprint of being. And what she could see in Kenya is how healthy bees are. So there's certain practices in countries with not many resources, where it was just easier not to get addicted to all this stuff, but just to stay connected with honeybees and to allow them to be bees and to follow their gestures, because bees know what is best for them. And if we really follow them fully, then we will be able to build an infrastructure which leads to the resilience and a very solid health of honeybees.
So what is your thoughts on the Varroa Mite?
So that poor Mr. Varroa, who was a Roman scholar 2,000 years ago, and I don't know why they named that mite after him. Maybe she brings wisdom, the mite. We'll find out, maybe in 100 years. But Varroa mites have been living in a well-balanced symbiosis with the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. And through global trading, that mite came in contact with the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. So there we have a host and a parasite, and they just met. It's kind of, they went on a dating trip, and they don't know really how to be with each other, and they have to find out how. But we don't allow them to get to know each other. Because it doesn't make sense for the parasite to kill the host only, which initially the Varroa Mite does to the honeybee. Because if that's the end of the story, then it's the end of the dating experience, and there's no one to date with, and actually it would be the death of the Varroa Mite too. Mm-hmm. The initial parasite-host encounter is very rocky, and it takes time for that relationship to balance for the benefit of both. The problem is that once the Varroa Mite arrived in the West, it was targeted with allopathic treatments up to this day. And the targeting of the Varroa Mite had a devastating effect on the honeybees. Thomas Seeley and others have all the data which show that untreated, left alone in wild ecosystems, that relationship will settle in a way where all of a sudden Varroa Mite will not kill honeybees anymore. But as long as we target Varroa Mites, we will prevent this rebalancing process from happening. So it's on us. We perpetuated a stressful, deadly condition by treating against Varroa. Varroa mites are now everywhere. I think there may be a very few exceptions, but it's present everywhere. And I always like to think in terms of Varroa mites as like a Varroa ocean. We are all connected as beekeepers through this Varroa ocean. The question is, how are we surfing the Varroa waves? So much more to say about that topic,
Sure.
right? But in a nutshell, the best approach is to create conditions which then empower that rebalancing process between Varroa and honeybees. That's, I think, the only scientifically based approach. Everything else will perpetuate that devastating situation and make it worse. Because we will also, by treating, we will favor the weakest. It's like endless. There's nothing, there's really nothing good in treating honeybees, treating against mites. So the mite is not the problem. It is our limited understanding of dynamics. That's the issue. That's the challenge. That's where we have to learn. That's my 10 cents on Varroa.
I appreciate that. I think it's worth much more than 10 cents. So you mentioned that, of course, one of the best ways to support the bee and the rewilding was the log hive. And I was just wondering if you could touch on that for a brief moment, just to better understand what the log hive concept is.
Yeah, I mean, the log hive, one could say, is a powerful link to native nest conditions of Apis mellifera. The log hive stands for millions of years of coevolution between trees and honeybees. The log hive exemplifies a healthy, natural nest habitat. So that's in general terms. The log hive then, because of all of that, rehabilitates the nest of, or one could say the hive conditions of honeybees. It returns also the birthrights of honeybees to live in a natural environment which mirrors their instinctual preferences and needs. A log hive provides harmoniously all that what honeybees need to be happy and healthy. Log hives mirror all those basic nest parameters. And we spoke about nest volume earlier. They are just small and represent the natural nest volume of honeybees. They provide a very well-insulated nest. Log hives are typically mounted far above the ground, so between 10 and 20 feet off the ground, because that is where honeybees belong. You know, when you, like the people in Kenya, they follow the gesture of honeybees. If you do this here and give them options, they will move in to the highest hive they can find. And I've seen it over and over again. There are hives on the ground, and then there's a hive up in a tree. They're not even looking at the hive at the ground. And that is just a way to study bees and preferences. And the more we know of those, the better we can provide by matching those preferences. So log hives are mounted up higher off the ground. And another thing about log hives is that the comb, that bees are not forced to build within a four-sided frame, but rather they're rewilded. The bees can grow their body tissue in an extremely harmonious and natural way, just the way they need it. Imagine when we are in utero, someone would come and insert frames in our liver and other organs and say, okay, so now the liver and the heart, you better grow within those frames. Anyway, maybe it's a silly way of comparing it, but you get the message.
I do.
And all of a sudden you'll see that comb actually never grows completely parallel, but it wants to undulate. It wants to be uneven and have all the variances in it. And let's look for a moment at what comb really is. And, comb is many things. Many organ-like functions are happening on comb. It's the skeleton. It's a communication organ. Jürgen Tautz refers to it as the comb wide web because so many communication features are happening on comb. Only as long as it's not within a four-sided frame, then it's a location for so many metabolic processes. It also constitutes a uterus. And here again, I'm quoting Jürgen Tautz. What is also known as the brood nest, and that's the conventional language. He refers to that brood nest as a social uterus. And, I'm asking often people, I say, imagine you have the choice to move frames in the brood nest or to move frames in the uterus. Where would you move frames, or where would you not want to move frames? And to call it a social uterus gives us an idea of what it really is. It reveals different functions and meaning. But it also, by calling it uterus, it also instills a sense of respect and dignity, and also it instills a sense of wanting to protect. You see the difference?
I do.
So that's what log hives do. They completely support the growth of all tissues inside of this being. Another really interesting part is everybody talks about propolis, and so bees forage for many things, but they forage for plant resins, bring it home, and inside it becomes propolis. You can imagine it's very sticky and has a very strong scent. Mm-hmm. And it belongs to this being on so many levels. It becomes this essential constituent for immunity and many other things. Now, a hive environment with frames will prevent certain dynamics, certain propolis dynamics from unfolding because it's impaired. So many processes are impaired through frames. And I've seen it in one of my first log hives. It was a brand new log hive. It was the first occupation of bees. And one could just see how the swarm was in this really explosive way. You know how it is, so quickly and fast will comb grow in the first 2-3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I could see that initially the inner walls of the log hive were all just wood. There was nothing applied onto it at all. But the moment the swarm moved in and comb started to grow, I could see, it was so obvious that with comb penetrating more and more volume of the log, that the so-called propolis envelope was just in sync with the growth of comb. In other words, as comb was growing one way, alongside on the nest walls, the propolis layer was also growing. They were just almost like twins. They belong to each other. And this is very important. This so-called propolis envelope is so important on so many levels. And it cannot evolve and grow freely in a framed nest environment. Those are just a few examples about log hives. This is my long answer to your question about log hives.
Sure. No, I appreciate that explanation. Is there any other topics that you would like to touch on?
It is important to pair the technical side, so to speak, the data and the research, with something called sentience. The meaning of sentience really is not limited to human beings. It's not even limited to animals. And maybe it's not even limited to plants. There's so many studies coming out showing that plants think and feel. And this princess flower, I'm sitting next to it, she not only knows that I'm sitting here, but she knows the color of my shirt. So there is the world of sentience, the world which allows us to discover that all living beings share the striving for happiness, but also that all living beings have a sense for pain, and that there's awareness of oneself in a specific environment. When it comes to honeybees, I find it really important not to limit oneself to the talk of hive systems and managements and programs, but also to allow time and effort for the discovery who this being is in front of us, who all those beings are in front of us, and how to develop ways to communicate with each other. In particular, honeybees, they have such a strong connection to the heart. It's not by accident that people feel drawn to honeybees. And even though they have a stinger, generally everybody loves honeybees. And it shows, it reflects that warmth and that heart quality of honeybees. And I do believe it's really important to pay attention to that heart and to practice and develop a friendship, like with other humans, but in this case with honeybees, and to not only perceive oneself as the one who looks at honeybees, but also to allow a sense of being perceived by bees, that it is a two-way street. The interesting thing is that other mammals, like dogs and cats and horses, they have something we call a face, with eyes and facial expressions and such things, which is so powerful and literally is an essential interface for communication, right? You look into someone's face, whether it's a human or a dog or a cat, and you pretty much know what's happening. Is that being happy? Does it need something? There's so much communication flowing just through faces without language. In the case of honeybees, we don't necessarily have a regular face. And here, it is an opportunity to be creative and to search. And most of all, to just allow moments without thinking, to allow moments without knowing, to be in such a way that for a moment, we don't know anything. And this is maybe how I can wrap up sentience. It will inform us as beekeepers and give us an additional dimension, which will be such an asset. And I would say it's essential for us to move forward. And this place of not knowing, I would say, has relevance to where we are in this world, because we are all trying to figure out how to live on this planet in a wholesome way. And to practice those moments of not knowing can be such a tremendous resource in our effort to find new ways. And often it begins with not knowing.
I think those are some incredibly powerful words.
Historically, in the culture of our ancestors, honeybees held this unique and utmost important position as the keeper of space and time, as this sacred being holding the essence of life. And we forgot that. And I think it is very important to reconnect with the wisdom aspects of honeybees. And there are many different ways of doing it, but it is very, very important.
I absolutely agree. So for those that have listened to your words and have maybe inspired something in them, and they would like to learn more about your research and your perspective on honeybees or the Apis arborea, how could they get more information?
If you're interested in learning more, you can go to apisarborea.com. It will give you kind of an impression of what we do. We have a bunch of videos listed. There are classes under the events section. Oh, by the way, we have several online interactive live streams coming up this fall, which cover different topics. So, and the idea of live stream is nice, so people don't have to burn carbon. It really lowers the carbon footprint by being able to meet like this. And there are other really good resources when it comes to arboreal apiculture. There is a strong movement in Europe, and they call themselves tree beekeepers or Zeitlers, Zeidler. But I think that's just in a nutshell places. And people can always email me if you have a question and you're looking for other resources. Send me an email. My email contact is on the website. I'm more than happy to help there and be a resource for others as well.
Wonderful. Well, I think that this will hopefully be a resource for others as well. And I know that I've certainly learned a lot, and certainly am going to walk away from this episode with a lot to think about. And Nicole, I really appreciate you taking the time with us and sharing some of that experience and that knowledge with us.
Oh, you're so welcome, Nicole. And I'm so grateful that you contacted me and that you wanted to dedicate some time towards it. And I hope it is helpful. Sometimes I'm just rumbling around and I'm just someone like you. I'm just searching and learning every day and being so grateful to be able to live in the presence of honeybees. And yeah. Anyway, so again, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and for your questions and your interest.
Of course, I very much enjoyed it, and I very much appreciate you returning my request to join us. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for listening to Backyard Bounty, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you for listening to Backyard Bounty, a podcast by heritageacresmarket.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. If you have a question you'd like us to answer on the show, please email us at ask@heritageacresmarket.com. Also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Heritage Acres Market. All the links mentioned in this podcast will be included in the description. See you again next week.